Today I'm joined by Julian Jones. Julian has been the head of strength and conditioning for the EIS for more than 20 years, has moved into a more senior role now. He's a board member of the Australian Strength and Conditioning Association. He prepared athletes for 6 Olympic cycles, including 38 Olympic medalists. Welcome, Julian.
Thanks, Christian. Good to be here.
Julian, I read you were a member of the organizing committee for the Sydney Olympics. How was that?
Yeah, that was an interesting dynamic because I was appointed as the competition director for weightlifting for the Sydney Olympics. I was appointed to that role in 1994 when the organising committee was put together. But I actually didn't fully complete that assignment, given that I was involved in the strength and conditioning role at the AIS that I've been in for a long period of time. And given that it was a home Olympics, we got to that stage of did I abandon my teams and my athletes with 2 years to go to follow through on the organisation of the competition, and literally, it's the end of that job anyway because the Olympics are over. So, or do I continue and actually go to the Olympics with one of the teams and make sure that we were there for the athletes and the coaches that we work with? So that was a decision that I made at the end of the day. So in 1998, I actually stopped working for the organising committee and really just honed in on making sure that the athletes and the coaches with the teams that I was working with then, so rowing, basketball and swimming, and then went to the games with the men's basketball team to make sure that we got the outcomes as best as we could at that time.
How did you get into strength and conditioning?
From my perspective, I was an Olympic weightlifter as an athlete, and the Australian Institute of Sport used to run a weightlifting program in its foundation years. So when it opened, there was only 10 sports involved with the AIS, and weightlifting was one of them. But as and I was a fairly young individual at the time, but as we progressed through, became a senior lifter, it was more of an interest in that strength and conditioning wasn't really perceived that as a full-time profession in this country, anyway, in Australia at the time. So there was a couple of people that dabbled in it, or had been a weightlifter or did some strength work while they were a player or an athlete, and would do a little bit on the side. But everyone knew the importance of doing strength training and conditioning, and the problem that we had at the Australian Institute of Sport was we were getting injuries from a number of athletes because there was no coaching for them or expertise in that coaching outside of the weightlifting program. But obviously the coaches in the weightlifting program were coaching weightlifters. So the physio department, who was headed up by a guy called Craig Purdom at the time, he's since retired, he actually asked me if I could do some rehab work. Was my initial into the actual strength and conditioning field from being a weightlifter myself. So it was more movement, correction and looking that the right movement patterns were done, not just from an Olympic lifting perspective, but right posture, a bit of self-discovery and a non-injury occurring technique with what they did. So that was my first sort of foray into the strength and conditioning area, and it just went from there because I'd done a bit of work across a number of, it wasn't work, it was voluntary, over a number of sports. So then you got a passion and a drive for it, and went from there.
Yeah. And just a quick question, Olympic weightlifting and strength and conditioning is a heated, discussed topic. Some use it synonymously, some say it has no place. What's your take on it?
You use it where it fits. My philosophy is that you're all about getting a performance gain, and it's about optimizing movement. Now, if that movement requires high speed, force at velocity, rates that are higher than what you would normally get with other modalities, then an Olympic lift will be a good way to teach and get those qualities moving along, because the sport will do it anyway. You just need to put them into an overload environment where you can use heavier resistances, so you get the adaptation at the neuromuscular and muscular level. So they're applicable in some sports, and they're not applicable in others. And it depends on what athlete you have in front of you as well. So, why would I give a shooter Olympic lifts? It might be fun to challenge them if they're a bit athletic, and sometimes we may do that because it's more around athletic prowess and they might like to do it. So would I stop them from doing it? No. But will it actually be a transfer into their sports performance? Probably not. So I wouldn't program it accordingly. But there's definitely sports that lend themselves to using Olympic movements, and you would program them accordingly if that's the case.
Yeah. And you've been in strength and conditioning for some time. Over the years, we have seen trends come and go. What were the trends that stayed, and what were the trends that were probably more fads?
That's an interesting one. And I think the fads definitely go around pieces of equipment more so than anything else, or a system that's trying to be sold. So probably the big one for me was the Swiss ball evolution. Suddenly it became you had to do everything on a Swiss ball, and it was all about core stability first before actually then strength and power development. And that was the one that sort of really took over everything that was being put forward at the time. And that's probably, early 90s to mid 90s, where that sort of craze just went ballistic there for a while, in terms of, don't bother squatting because you can try and stand on a Swiss ball. And as we know, completely different capacities in what we're talking about here. And actually, does that transfer into the activity that you want to have a better sporting performance from? There's elements of, but it's a case of the selling mechanism, the promotion is a hard one to swallow when you know that activation patterns are different, even muscle recruitment situations are different. But then in lots of ways you can't measure that either. So you've really got to go with a capacity change, because as a good colleague of mine says, the muscle doesn't have eyes. So if you can just increase the capability of the musculature, and then your brain dictates what you're going to do with that musculature, then you can actually get better capacities in the movement patterns that you're after. Yeah. The other one for me that seems to be doing the rounds now is more so the velocity-based pieces of equipment that are out there that are trying to tell you that we can strap it onto one piece of our anatomy and it gives us the velocity of what we're trying to do with certain body parts. I'm not a big believer in velocity from an arm exercise only. Multi-muscular exercises where you want velocity predominantly, because in most of the sporting activities that we're involved in, velocity initiates at the hip. Now it can go down the chain or up the chain, but you've got to train it that way. So trying to say that you'll strap on a linear transducer on your forearm to say that your squat's going well, it's probably a long bow to draw from my perspective. And the reliability and validity studies are few and far between.
Yeah. In your life as an S&C coach, what was the darkest moment?
Oh, that's an interesting one. It's probably, and you can say one or the other, but it's when an athlete actually really has a major injury. That's the bit, and whether it's during one of your training sessions, and that's knee anterior cruciate ruptures and things like that, where you might be just doing drills. I've had a couple of those over the years. Shoulder issues, dislocations and stuff like that. Again, are the things that you sort of look at it, but it's inherent in high performance sport. You're pushing the envelope. You're trying to get them into boundaries that they've never been before, because that's the sporting outcome that they're striving for. So, unfortunately, it's the environment we're in, and they are dark moments. And you think about them forever and a day, actually, in terms of, could I have done something different? But it's a case of that's just accepting that whilst we promote high performance sport as a health message, really by the time our athletes have gone through that high performance sport spectrum, they're probably not the healthiest individuals you'll see in retirement, put it that way.
What was your best moment?
Look, I've probably got a couple of Olympic Games. I'm married to an Olympic champion who I've obviously coached and had a major input into. So 2004 Olympic Games in Athens. My wife won 3 Olympic gold medals in swimming. So butterfly and 2 relays from that one, after 3 shoulder reconstructions, which we did the rehabilitation for, and then obviously the performance capacity work over that whole time for. So that's a highlight. Other ones is the men's basketball team coming 4th at the Sydney Olympics. We could have won a medal there, but we didn't have a good game against France that we'd beaten in the lead-up tournament. So we were knocked out of the semis, and we came up short against Lithuania in the bronze medal match. But that was a highlight. Other things like in rowing, the men's 8 in Sydney, the women's pair in Athens. Again, they're all medalist type situations, and just the fruit of your work is they turn around and they thank you for it, and that's all you can expect. But you just get, when you actually go and see the physical outcome and watch that event, and you've been part of that team and part of those athletes progress for quite some time. They're the highlights that you get when they turn around and it all comes together, and they win a world championship, Olympic Games, or they win an Olympic medal. That's the buzz. That's the buzz stuff.
If you could travel back in time, what advice would you give a younger Julian?
Probably some of the aspects that a couple of my mentors over the years have told me was I tended to be probably too black and white early on in my S&C career. And Al Vermeil, I did an interview for him for last year's ASCA conference, for our online conference. And he actually reminded me of something he told me. I went to visit them when he was at the Chicago Bulls in 1997. And he said, don't get caught up with the absolute correct or the perfect figure that you're after. He said, we all work within a spectrum. And I think that's as sound advice then as it is now, in that it doesn't have to be perfect or when you're doing it, and it's within a framework of the things that you want to get done. So don't get caught up with collecting all the data, so you've got all these entry points and it maps this way. It's about actually building the relationship with the athlete, so they'll commit to do what you want them to do, and they believe that you've got their best interests at heart. So don't get too technical, and don't get caught up with the pure data situation.
Yeah.
Which I think early on was a case of, I needed to program this way, and I needed to get X amount of tonnage or reps in, from that perspective. And really, what's the difference, from doing 5s and 3s to 6s and 4s? It's not a whole lot in the end of the day.
Yeah. Considering you are in Olympic sports for so long, did you never contemplate to go into professional sports? A lot of people see that as the holy grail.
I dabbled early in my career in professional sports. So I did a season with rugby league here in Australia, which is a major sort of professional sport, North Sydney Bears. And I've worked with domestic professional basketball clubs as well. So I did go into that area a little bit, but at that time, again, you weren't surrounded with a team of staff that seems to be around those teams now, and getting into the situation and the organisation that I was in, I had the opportunity to actually work full time across a number of sports at the same time. So it actually helped me think more laterally, I think. And this is something that I find from some of my former staff that have gone on to work in professional clubs, is that they like the institute network, as we call it here, with the ability to work with 2 or 3 sports, because it keeps their lateral thinking and their challenging mechanism up, rather than they've got a squad of 40 guys on the roster and it's just football or it's just baseball, and that's all they work with. They find that after 3 or 4 years in the same environment, they don't look and challenge themselves laterally as much as they used to. So whilst, yes, I definitely had looked at those sorts of things in getting into an environment in the Olympic situation where you're employed full time and then seeing the fruits of your outcomes, it's a case of, are you money driven, or are you, is your getting your athletes and coaches outcomes the bit that drives you? Money will come, and it's nice to have X amount of money, but it's a situation of, what's that passion and what's that drive.
Yeah, and that's what most SMC people get into. They get into it because of the passion. Huh? So if you suddenly change,
that's right. Yeah,
it can be frustrating. I think I've heard that. Hey, what advice would you give young aspiring SMC coaches?
Talk to as many people and go and observe and look at coaching sessions of other coaches as much as possible. It's not a one size fits all, and you don't want clones produced. You want people that can take and filter information and apply it to the environment that's in front of them. I always love it when people ask me for the program of the person that was successful, because they don't know, and they want the program that they're on now. So they don't know what they were on 4 weeks before, or what they were doing 2 years ago. What were the elements that we actually targeted to say, well, we need to get some capacity or performance shifts here, because this will translate into a better capability in performing this part of the race or playing in this part of the game. I think you need to be able to be a critical thinker of what different modalities might apply where. And we always look around at, do they respond to this type of programming or not? Well, it's dependent on the athlete in front of you, and how different coaches go about that actually gives you a much broader range of opportunity to program in different ways to get the outcome that you're after. So you don't follow a single pathway and be dogmatic that, well, if I'm not getting the gains that I'm after, so I'll go again with the same thing. Think differently, apply different processes, think outside the box to get your athlete, to make those shifts.
Yeah. I found a comment of you which deeply resonated with you. I'm going to read it and hopefully not butcher it here. It's a real issue that the SNC industry faces, as the university sector in most cases does not make the student job ready. they will have good knowledge, but no experience or the skill to complete the job done. Why it resonates so strongly with me, this is basically the feeling I had when I left university and took up my first job, that I realized I have to learn a lot of things by myself and I wasn't taught, which I expected. Can you expand on that comment?
Sure. Look, university, and I'm making a bit of a sweeping statement here, but it is in general. Universities in general are teaching you from a knowledge acquired situation. Okay, they will fill you up with knowledge and then teach you critical thinking strategies in how to apply that knowledge. They don't develop your skill sets. So how do you influence someone to train with the intent that you want them to? It's those are the skills that we call them soft skills or tactical skills here. Obviously translates differently around the world, but it means the same thing. It's, can you relate to the athlete? Can you establish trust and rapport and a belief mechanism that you can get the most out of your athlete's training capability and application that you can possibly get? You don't get that in a university course. So we look at it in terms of, and we do what we call success profiles here in our recruitment situation. And there's 4 quadrants that go with being successful in a role. And university academic qualifications are only in 1 quadrant. So you've got another 3 to go before you'll actually be successful in that role. And it's part of the journey. And hence why I say to younger coaches is, yes, you're doing your university degree, but get out and coach. Get out and formulate how you would build rapport with this type of coach over that type of coach in the sport. Because ultimately, if you're not on side and part of the performance team that the coach has around their team or in that sport, then you can't get your job done as effectively as you could do. You might be the smartest, most intelligent person in the room, but if you can't communicate at their level and establish that influence, doesn't matter.
Yeah. And how would you see an ideal scenario from a university curriculum to educate S&C coaches?
It's more around looking at mentoring and coaching opportunities, and not just in one sport either. You want them to actually, as I said before, have a number of different sport touch points, so you see how they handle different types of athletes for starters, and then how different shapes and sizes they need to accommodate that and actually sell their message, gain influence, and be able to then apply their trade. When you can do that as a natural thing, and it's not as daunting for you to do it, then you're a more relaxed and more confident coach, and that comes across to your athletes as well.
Yeah. And you've alluded to it. The next question is about the qualities of an S&C coach. You have hired multiple S&C coaches. What are the qualities you look for? You said education is 1 out of the 4. What are the other 3?
Work ethic, a reflective nature. Can they do that? The other bit is that that they're team motivated rather than me motivated. Because at the end of the day, you're a support staff. You're not the person who's going to be put in front of the TV screen or the paper article. The athlete is, or the actual sport coach is. So you need to actually look at those qualities. Some of those that you can enhance. Some of them are ingrained. I think we have the debate of whether being a generalist or a specialist, and definitely a case of everyone actually should have a specialty area, but it doesn't prevent them from doing general activities. But in some cases, you will get the specialist saying, "Oh, that's not my job. I can't do that." Well, you've got to be part of the team And that's the work ethic thing. You know, if you've got to drive the bus to the airport to pick up the athletes who've come in the second stage and you're the strength and conditioning coach, go and drive the bus. It gives you far more opportunity to actually build influence with the athletes that you've just picked up at the airport. And they actually then go, oh, you're the guy that picked us up at the airport. Oh, but you're the strength. Oh, good on you. You actually came and got us. Thanks. You know, it's different ways of doing that. So it's definitely, when you look to hire people, it's that work ethic and then that growth mindset that comes with it. Are they prepared to tinker and tweak and adjust and adopt different ways of doing things as they become better coaches and better research and evidence comes out that they will be able to apply them into the programming and into their workload.
Yeah. Let's move into more S&C coaching questions. What is your coaching philosophy?
Movement optimization first, and everything hangs off that. It's about performance. So it's not about whether they need strength work, power work, endurance conditioning. It's, do they move well? Is it injury occurring? So I'll need to correct it. And do they have the capacities to optimize that movement? And have they got capacity to actually get better performance outcomes? And that's my coaching philosophy with the athletes, is that you've got to build trust, honesty, and good rapport so you can actually make them better people at the end of the day. And also, I tend to have a philosophy with myself and my staff in that you actually want to make yourself redundant. I don't think you ever do. It's just a case of you have different stages of the maturity of your athlete. So you coach them in different ways. Your cues are different as they progress through their careers. So that's my coaching philosophy, is, you know, really it's athlete-centered, coach-driven, built around trust, honesty, and a good rapport, but then evidence-based applications of methodology that will optimize the performance outcomes around movement efficiencies.
Yeah. What are your core values?
Oh, honesty, loyalty, respect would be, you know, big ones, and then teamwork, really. I think it's, you know, those 3 or 4 things underpin most of the things that we do. I'm a big believer that people are who they are, and even to say, well, you know, I always find it interesting when we get assessed on how we align to the values of the organisation, because you're not going to suddenly change your values as a person if you've got a job in a different organisation and they've got different values. That should actually be part of the recruitment situation, and you're never going to probably align up 100% all of the time, because that's, you know, that's the corporate world of, you know, values of the organisation. And yes, that anchors some of the activities that you do in those organisations, but you as a person, those values are established by your parents, really, and the environment that you're brought up in. And if you can demonstrate those along the way and even identify them, that's an absolute bonus, because you hold yourself accountable in those areas and from a self-reflection perspective.
Yeah. Which is the person that has impacted you most and why?
That's an interesting one. My father actually was my weightlifting coach, and he still is a weightlifting coach at 82 years of age. He still goes down and coaches 3 times a week at one of the gyms on our campus, actually, because it's the local Institute of Sport that's on our campus these days. But in terms of you know, influencing what I do as a person, and where my background of, you know, looking at strength and power and force application, he's a very well-read, very evidence-based person, and that's probably had the most influence on my life, given that, you know, he's probably the person I've spent the most time with from being born to this day in that situation, and having discussions around that. And then look, it's a couple of guys that I've worked with over the years. The national basketball coach that I work with here for 12 years, Barry Barnes, and the national rowing coach from for Australia, who's a German Romanian, Reinhold Barchi, who was the national coach for rowing in Australia from 1976 till 2000. So he's had a lot of influence in terms of what you're looking at, coaching principles. So whilst he's a hard taskmaster, it's all about the feel. What did you think was the difference between that movement and this movement, and can you articulate it? It's the art. Well, that's the bit in watching him coach. In whilst he's got his loading, his sets and reps, his distances, and all those sort of things squared away, it's more around the feel and how to get the athlete to really recognize and hone in on that's been a big influence.
Yeah, that's a bit of I don't want to say forgotten, but I think it's not very often mentioned that is also a big part of training. Huh? So very often we are busy with the quantifiable stuff, the sciencey side, but then actually the art of coaching, that is something that's not very often spoken about.
Absolutely, and especially as technology gets better and better, and we produce more pieces of equipment that can measure certain bits that we want to. I mean, you look at it 20 years ago, and if you could actually get access to a force plate, you were lucky. Whereas now most facilities have got them, and then we've got portable linear position transducers as well. So we've got elements of feedback from a number point. And I think that's a trap that younger coaches get into as well, is to say, oh, I've moved your power output from 12,000 watts to 2,000 watts. But could you have done that by getting them to move correctly and know what the feeling of that right movement pattern is? You could have done that in half an hour instead of 6 weeks of your program.
Yeah. Talking about dealing with individuals, as an S&C coach, we have certain expectations and ideas, but sometimes the individual, the athlete, has different ideas. How do you manage expectations?
That's a good one. And that comes back to the relationship you form with the athlete. And I guess it also comes down to at what stage do you start working with that athlete? Because it's a different relationship the older the athlete becomes. It's more a command and control with a younger athlete. You're not going to get into the discussion with a 15-year-old that you'll get into with a 25-year-old. So it's dependent on what the outcomes are. But it's first up, it's about building that trust that they believe that you have their best interests at heart, which we should have as the coach. We want to optimize their performance outcome. Now, if they are dogmatic around some of the bits that they want to do, which clash with what you want to do, I don't have a problem initially allowing them to do some of that stuff. But it's a case of then measuring it and seeing if we get the gains or the shift in the capacity that we're after. And if it means that we've got to, forsake 2 or 3 months to actually demonstrate and get that buy-in, I mean, I'll be doing other things as well. So it's a bit of a trade-off in that you can demonstrate to them that, you probably weren't going to get what you thought you were going to get out of this. And here's the data that backs that up.
Yeah. It reminds me on what John Mitchell said, give a little to receive a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the whole thing. And I think that's even, that's with coaches as well as athletes. It's you see some people that, they want to come in and I'll now dictate what goes on with the program, and the sport coach is like going, hey, hang on a minute. No, you're not. You can't come in with that sort of philosophy straight up because you haven't established the relationship. So if you're not going to give some to get some, and that's a classic example, with the rowing head coach that I mentioned before. When I started working with rowing, I came in and it was, here's the program that we're going to do. So I was there for technical feedback and movement correction. Whereas 2 years later, it was, what are we doing? Because you spent the time and you invested heavily to get that return. So ultimately, you became fully in charge of the whole thing. Whereas if you'd actually gone in the first thing when they gave you the program and said, oh, we're not doing that, you would have been shown the door. It's plain and simple. Yeah. So then you're not going to have any influence and you're not going to gain anything out of that other than looking for another job.
Yeah. And it's also ultimately what a lot of people, I think, do not fully understand. The head coach is the ultimate responsible, right? So if you come in as a newbie,
absolutely,
and then he or she doesn't fully know you and what you're capable of, but if you implement something new and it goes wrong, it's his or her head that is chopped off. So
well, and that's exactly right. And you need to appreciate the situation that they're in, because they're in relatively short-term contracts at the end of the day, and they can't afford to have any sort of major setbacks in the environment that they've got, because it's literally, if they're on a 4-year contract, it's really not a long time in an athlete's career. And if it means that they're out for 6 to 12 months because of something that happened, they can't afford to do that. And we as support staff, and even though we're coaches as well, we are to actually back up that situation.
Talking about support staff, in a team of support staff, everyone is wearing its own hat. When there's conflict or different ideas and a decision is taken that you don't necessarily resonate with, how do you deal with that?
It's looking at it, look, everyone's different and everyone is who they are. I think this is a bit of a misnomer in when you're leading teams, is that who you've got in your team is who you've got. What you need to make the team aware of is what type of people each of them are, and yourself, so they know how to work with you and you know how to work with them. We don't spend enough time doing that. And if we spend then too much time in isolation by ourselves and only come together infrequently, it's really dominated by, I'm in isolation and it's about what I want to do, rather than what the team collectively wants to come to. So you want a multidisciplinary team to come out with interdisciplinary solutions. So everyone has input, but ultimately it's the performance outcome that we all land and agree on. Now, there'll be certain bits that you can trade off or sequentially go, well, look, I can't do that until you do this. And you build that understanding. But if it's something that, I tend to always look at, if it's not something that I would do, why are they doing it? And is it driven for a performance outcome to optimize the athlete, or is it driven because they want to do something? If it's not the first, then I would challenge. If it is the first, then that's fine, because there'll be an opportunity in that sequential progression for me to actually put the bits in that I want to put in.
Yeah. How does a typical training day or a typical day in the life of an S&C coach or head of S&C look like?
Well, as head of S&C, it's good because you can choose whether you get up early or not. So coming from being aquatics based as well as swimming and water polo, I've spent a lot of time coaching as well, and they're early morning sessions. So in lots of cases, that was a case of working with the coach to actually stop them from trying to do some strength work before they went in the pool. So 5 a.m. trying to get them in the gym to do something so they can get in the pool at 6 sort of defeats the purpose, as we know. But traditionally and culturally in swimming, they tend to try and do whatever they can do with the athlete when they've got them, rather than a structured day situation when they become senior sort of athletes. But for me, it's normally around an 8 o'clock start. in walking the facilities actually in terms of where the staff are delivering whatever they're doing, and following up with the sports as to how it's going. Then getting into these days looking and meeting with my senior sort of staff as to what's on their agendas for the day or the week with their teams, because my senior staff have junior staff reporting to them or facility staff reporting to them in terms of what we want to get done. And then we flow through to planning, strategic views of things, operational views of things, because they're different. Obviously, in one's a longer term horizon and one's here and now. And we always have a here and now issues. Something will crop up every day that has to be fixed now. So those things are taken care of, and then it's afternoon training sessions that come after that, and a bit of a debrief before we go home, and reflection on the planning in a typical day. But then on certain days we'll do review of programming, review of annual plans, working with the sports engagement wise around what is their performance barriers and what can we help them with. And it might not necessarily, as we come to that performance team question, fall wholly and solely to strength and conditioning. It may actually fall to biomechanics or physio or physiology to actually get something done before we'll do some intervention sort of stuff. So it's continually updating and being in a dynamic environment of planning and delivery over each day and each week.
Yeah. How do you design a training program, step by step?
I really look at, we base it off planning from the performance gaps of the athlete or the team in front of us. So it's looking at, use swimming as an example. We break that up into the 4 elements of the swimming race. Are they deficient in any of the free swimming areas or the start or the turn? Or, I mean, the 4 parts we say is a finish, but the finish takes care of itself really, because they've got nothing left in the tank when they're actually hitting the wall. So that's not going to make much difference there. But so starts, turns, free swimming. Are they strong enough to hold the right technique? Have they got the right length? Because that's what swimming's about, strength and length. Do they not shorten up during the race? Do they apply enough force off the block and off the turn to optimize their start time and their turn time? Once you know what the elements are and what bits you need to work on, what capacities and qualities do they need to actually execute those things? So if they need to apply more force, have they got enough musculature to apply more force? Now, some do, so their musculature is not at their optimal level of application, but some of them don't have enough musculature. You look at it when swimming, especially, you go, well, you're not going to really apply much force out of those legs. So we'll address them, and then look at it as I tend to look at it from a whole body down to a segmented situation. As I program, I'll do the multimuscular movements and coordinated movements, or if it's velocity as well, they'll go first, and then we cascade down to some of those single joint movements towards the end if that's necessary. Always start off with some of the rehab prehab situations. So swimming, again, we always do some shoulder internal external rotation every day of the program. They can't do enough of that. So if they're only doing 3 or 4 strength and conditioning sessions a week, then they need to do 3 or 4 sessions of internal external rotation, because they do way too many internal rotation when they're swimming. So anything of a resisted and increased resisted nature we can do there. We always put that first. So we just reinforce that capacity that we're trying to optimize so they don't put themselves in an injury occurring situation. And that's the way I do that. Conditioning wise, I tend to now work with the sport coach more so that the conditioning is more of a remedial conditioning. So the conditioning component is taken care of in the sport component, because there's nothing more laborious with some of your athletes than trying to do some conditioning work in most cases. If you can integrate that into the sporting session itself, then the more attentive and the more intent they have with doing it, I find. But obviously at certain points in time, they'll come off the ball, or they might have a niggly injury for a little while, and their capacities will drop down. So you'll do some remedial stuff there with them, and then put them back into the sport environment once they're ready.
We're getting to the end of the interview. Do you want to nominate someone to be interviewed?
It's a good one, actually. It'd be depending on. I don't know who you've already talked to. I know some of them, but not all of them in that way. And a guy that's done very well, that came through as a scholarship coach in our program, and to this day he's a good coach, and he develops a number of people now. But Adam Baird, who's at the Chicago Cubs these days, he was at Cleveland Browns before that, and Welsh Rugby before that. But the way he now integrates his performance team, because he's the performance director at the Cubs, but he's come from strength and conditioning, like myself, but he's done it in an earlier situation and in the professional codes. So there's some interesting stories of cultural biases in American sports, and things that he has to navigate, that you and I probably were thinking, geez, how do you do that? But so he's got to deal with agents telling the players what they should be doing and not doing, because they get a cut of what the player does, and it's millions and millions of dollars. So it's a huge influence, even to the tune of player association agreements with the leagues. So in American football, you can't test the players if the players don't want to be tested, and it can't be held against them. So how do you do your programming? Yeah. So it's a different way of doing things that we wouldn't ordinarily take on board, as if, what do you mean they don't do that? Yeah, well, they don't have to. So it's a different environment from what you would think. So it will be an interesting chat.
Absolutely. What's going on in the life of Julian Jones at this moment in time?
Dealing with trying to get sports into our facilities for their training camps because of COVID restrictions, to be honest. Obviously, then looking further down the track as to the makeup of my team to optimize the outcomes that we're after. We keep making subtle tweaks around what our staff makeup is. We looked at today we're even talking about instigating a new early career practitioner development program for the system in Australia. We dabbled with having some full-time roles to optimize that, but we've probably think now that it's better to do some fast-track workshops over a 2-year period by people who are already employed in the system, but don't have any more than about 4 or 5 years experience, but they have at least 2 years experience, because your first 2 years is massive learning curve, whatever you're going to do. So we spent quite a bit of time today talking about how we could do that, and looking at some of the proposals that have been put forward, because it's something coming back from coaches that that they need people, as we've discussed earlier in this, that are team players on their performance teams, as well as being very good at the delivery of their specialty area, and strength and conditioning is one of them.
Yeah. And you have moved into a more senior role. I read something about the AWE policy. What's that about?
That's an interesting one. So that was a policy that was launched 7 years ago. It's actually not in effect anymore, but I've moved into a different role now, where at the IAS we had a restructure in 2018, which pretty much instead of employing support staff in large numbers, we've given the money to the sports to employ them if they want them. And we now have a core team of support people I've got 16 practitioners across dietitians, physiology, strength and conditioning, nutrition, the gambit that you would normally have, psychology in your performance team. So that takes care of whatever sort of resident programs we have on the Canberra campus, and then visiting sports that come in and use it for training camp location. So we service them and we help them in their performance outcomes. So it's nowhere near as big an organisation in the support area as it was. We had 110 staff in the support area to start off with. And then after the restructure, we're down to 24.
And what was the rationale for the restructure?
It was a case of sports it was based off the feedback that sports gave. They weren't getting what they wanted to get. We were giving them what we had. So it's one of those things which is hard to do when you've got a bigger staff cohort and they've been working in the system for quite some time, is to tinker around the edges as we're doing now and change some of those roles if you need them. So if we didn't one year need as many physiologists, we couldn't just get rid of them because of our work laws in this country. So we would end up saying, if a sport needed a psychologist or a strength and conditioning coach and we only had a physiologist, they would complain about that, and rightly so. So it was a situation of, well, if we give the money to the sports at the level that they've been getting sort of the people allocation element, they can pick and choose where they spend their money. The problem we found with that, though, having said that, like no system's perfect. There's give and take all around the edges, is that they don't realise what the market worth is of good practitioners.
Yeah.
So they're always trying to spend as little as they can, but want the best quality, which it never works.
Yeah. And almost the last question, which is probably a whole interview in itself. What are the biggest challenges on a management level?
Oh, that's an interesting one, because to me, there's a big difference between leading and managing. And I think that's an issue in lots of organizations in what they call senior management, is that you need some leaders in there. You don't want box tickers, if you know what I mean. Oh, well, we've done this and we've done this and we've done that. No, but you haven't led the team to actually get the outcomes with the drive and the passion that you want them to optimize that environment. And I think that's one of the misnomers that we have, is that we try and promote, or people see that because I'm technically good, I should therefore be in this management role. But then they don't do the management. They don't lead. They actually do more of what they did before, take the title of the role, and but don't then lead the teams. And that's probably the biggest challenge, I think, in the support areas, is that you actually need leaders who are prepared to lead and manage, not can do the continuation of what they used to do as a technical practitioner.
Yeah, I would believe it's probably a bit of a balancing act. You see that very often if we look at our industry, the strength and conditioning, you are a coach and you move on into becoming a strength and conditioning manager, which is good because you understand what strength and conditioning entails. But management is also a skill that somewhat you need to learn in leadership, right? So
absolutely, and you've got to invest time in that, because it is different to coaching. It's you really have to work with different types of people and get the best out of them in the working environment, and especially if you step outside of certain disciplines. I mean, we can make stereotypical comments about strength and conditioning in that there are, particular types of people in strength and conditioning, but we have a spectrum. But then if you actually went and said, well, does that compare with the dietitians? Well, then you've got an even bigger spectrum in what you've got to work at. So you've got to work out what motivates them to get their outcomes is not the same as what motivates a strength and conditioning coach to get their outcomes. So you have to be aware of that, and you need to communicate in the right way to optimize those things. And that takes time and effort, and you've got to learn that stuff.
Yeah. Last question. There's hardly anything to find about you. Where can people find you online?
I'm only on one social media situation. I only use Twitter, mainly because I can get sporting results quickly on that one and get that. I'm not a big fan of using social media sort of components because you have to spend time doing that, which means you give up time coaching or programming or looking at things that can optimize your athlete and coach output. So I've got a LinkedIn profile. I go through that a little bit, but Twitter is probably the main one. But so between those two, you can get a hold of me and you see a few things that I make comments on and things like that. But outside of that, it's more I'm probably classified as old school. Is talk to me like this or send me an email, and I'm happy to chat and share views on how we go about things.
Really cool. Julian, thanks a lot for sharing your experiences. Thank you.
No problem. Been a pleasure.